Welcome, Bio4. We're moving on to part 8 of muscle. And here we're going to get away from skeletal muscle a little bit, and we're going to look at cardiac. And we're going to look at smooth muscle and see how is it different. You know, we've looked at a sarcomere, we've seen the myosin, we've seen the actin. Is it the same in cardiac muscle, or is it different? So let's look. Cardiac muscle is very similar to skeletal, and when you drew it in your lab, right, you had to draw those. You notice that they're actually similar because they had striations. So sometimes it's hard to tell those apart when you're looking at them under a microscope or in the drawings that you were looking at. However, the cardiac muscle tends to have one nucleus only. It is very rich in glycogen and myoglobin. Why would that be? Why would you want it to have a whole lot of glycogen, which is the fuel for that muscle, and a lot of myoglobin that's going to give it oxygen, so that it has glucose and it has oxygen so that it can make a lot of ATP. Okay? It has large mitochondria. If you were to look at what percentage of the cell is occupied by mitochondria, it would be about 25%. So here you have these little factories that are converting glucose into ATP, because this muscle can't stop. It can't relax like any other muscle can in the body, right? So very important that it doesn't run out of energy, that it doesn't fatigue. It's very, very resistant to fatigue. Remember that it does have the striations, which means that the actin and the myosin are also aligned in that parallel fashion, and you'd be able to see the dark and light banding if you looked at it under the microscope. Okay, how about smooth muscle? How is that different? So an intestine, for example. Well, it too has the thin and the thick filaments, but it's different. They're not in alignment. And if they're not parallelly aligned, then guess what? You're not going to see those striations. You're not going to see the dark band and the light band. So even though it does have that ability to contract and the actin is going to slide, it's going to look different when you look at it under the microscope. The other really big difference about this muscle is that it can reproduce, it can grow, right? It has mitosis, so it makes more cells. So it makes sense in the uterus where it has to grow, right? So the pregnant uterus is going to grow and it's going to make more cells. And that doesn't happen in skeletal muscle. Even when you have muscle bulk, that you've been doing weights for a long time, you're not really creating new cells. The old cells are splitting. You're not creating new ones in skeletal muscle. But in smooth muscle, yes, absolutely, you get new cells. There is no direct innervation from a neuron, is what I'm telling you here. So we talked about before in skeletal muscle how every single skeletal muscle cell needed to have a connection to a neuron or a branch of a neuron in order for it to contract. And here, that is not true. It is not true. So think about how smooth muscle contracts. You know, does it need to be exceedingly precise, like the muscles in your fingers, for example? Or can the contractions of your bowels be sort of uncoordinated and a little floppy, right? It doesn't need to be perfect. So usually those movements in the intestine are slow, and they sustain a contraction, and then they relax. They don't need to be fast. And so the form of it is very different, as is the function. So the way this works is, look at this neuron here lying among all these cells. And on it, it has these little enlargements that are called varicosities. And these varicosities have a neurotransmitter in them. And these are the varicosities that are going to sort of let go of this chemical. This chemical is going to bathe all this area. And by bathing all that area will contract. Very different from the other skeletal where we needed one extension coming to each one of these cells, right? It's not like that. So instead, we have a neuron that will sit in that space between the cells. I'm going to do it in black now and go in between here and release neurotransmitter, and all those cells would contract. They have a low energy requirement also. It doesn't need a whole lot of energy to slowly contract and move food through your bowels. So quite different. This is just showing you how that muscle contracts slowly and it relaxes slowly. And it's going to enable maintenance of tone, which means it's going to maintain a little bit of rigidity even though an organ is empty. So for example, a stomach that doesn't have anything in it doesn't collapse into a wet balloon, an empty wet balloon. It still keeps its shape. So that comes from that smooth muscle. It's able to maintain tone. Okay, and those are the differences in summary between skeletal muscle and cardiac and skeletal muscle and smooth. So I wanted to mention that in bodybuilding, how do you build muscle? Well, you know, a lot of weight. Once you force that muscle to lift something heavier and heavier and heavier every day you're doing this, it's going to create more bulk, but it doesn't create more cells. So it realizes that you are in need of greater force to be able to lift these weights, and so it creates that greater force, but it does it by splitting the myofibrils, so you get more actin and more myosin, but not more cells. So some believe that the cells actually get so big they split in two, and by splitting it increases that bulk. And that's how bodybuilding works. We're going to stop here, and in the last